Ma'am, please step outside. We need to speak with you.
Officer, you are almost out of time.
If you're so certain someone is dangerous, the calm voice asked through the still morning air, why does it take 30 police cars to face one woman? At exactly 5:47 a.m., the quiet suburban street in Arlington, Virginia, stopped feeling like home. Red and blue emergency lights painted every front porch, every parked sedan, every white picket fence with restless flashes that reflected across rain-damp pavement. Neighbors peeked through half-open blinds, clutching coffee mugs they had barely touched, while others stepped cautiously onto their front lawns wrapped in robes against the cool 62-degree morning. No one could remember ever seeing anything like it. Patrol cruisers blocked both ends of the street. Black SUVs lined the curb. Officers in tactical gear moved with disciplined precision, speaking into radios that crackled beneath the distant hum of a helicopter circling overhead. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Every eye settled on a modest two-story brick house with pale blue shutters and a small American flag hanging beside the front door. It wasn't the largest house on the block. It wasn't the newest. Its flower beds were carefully maintained, and the porch swing still rocked gently from the breeze left behind by the night's passing storm. It belonged to Naomi Carter, a woman nearly everyone on the street knew, yet almost no one truly understood. She smiled whenever she walked her golden retriever through the neighborhood park. She shoveled snow for elderly neighbors before clearing her own driveway. Every Veterans Day, she quietly placed fresh flowers beneath the small memorial outside the county courthouse without telling anyone why. To most people, she was simply the quiet black woman who preferred privacy over conversation. That morning, privacy had disappeared. Captain Ethan Brooks stepped away from the command vehicle, adjusting the microphone clipped to his tactical vest. His expression remained controlled, but the tension in his jaw suggested a night without sleep. He accepted a folder from another officer, glanced at it one final time, then looked directly toward Naomi's house. Around him, dozens of officers waited for his next instruction. Cameras had already begun appearing. A local news van rolled slowly onto the next street, its satellite dish rising toward the gray sky. Someone across the street lifted a phone and started live streaming. Within minutes, strangers online were already guessing what terrible crime must have happened inside the quiet blue house. Captain Brooks raised the loudspeaker. Naomi Carter, his voice echoed through the neighborhood. Step outside with your hands visible. His words bounced off brick walls and quiet front porches before disappearing into an uneasy silence. Nothing happened. No movement behind the curtains. No footsteps. Only the helicopter continued tracing patient circles overhead. Several officers exchanged uncertain looks. One younger deputy whispered, "Maybe she's gone." Another shook his head. "Command says she's inside." Captain Brooks waited another 10 seconds before repeating the order. Again, silence answered him. Across the street, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons tightened her sweater. She had lived next door to Naomi for 8 years. She remembered borrowed sugar, shared Christmas cookies, and afternoons when Naomi helped neighborhood children fix broken bicycles without asking for anything in return. She stared at the officers, unable to connect the woman she knew with the scene unfolding before her. Then, just as another officer stepped toward the front gate, the porch light switched on. The front door opened slowly. Naomi Carter appeared wearing dark jeans, a gray sweater, and soft house slippers. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't trying to explain herself before anyone asked a question. Instead, she calmly looked across the line of patrol cars, then briefly toward the worried faces of her neighbors. Her eyes lingered for only a second before settling on Captain Brooks. There was no anger in her expression, no fear, only the quiet composure of someone who had expected this moment long before anyone else realized it was coming. Then she spoke, her voice steady enough that even the helicopter suddenly seemed farther away. "Captain," she said, "you're almost out of time. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next." Captain Ethan Brooks studied Naomi's face, searching for the panic he expected to find, but it never appeared. Instead, she stood with one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, as though 30 police vehicles outside her home were nothing more unusual than a delivery arriving too early. The silence stretched across the street until one of the younger officers shifted uneasily and glanced toward his captain for direction. Brooks lowered the loudspeaker and walked several steps closer, stopping just outside the front gate. "Miss Carter," he called in a firm but measured voice. "We have reason to believe someone connected to an active federal investigation may be inside this residence. I am asking you one final time to cooperate." Naomi listened without interrupting. The cool morning breeze stirred a loose strand of hair across her cheek, yet she made no effort to brush it aside. Her attention remained fixed on the captain, calm and unwavering. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked again. Brooks held up a folder. "We have legal authority to continue this investigation." Naomi nodded once, neither agreeing nor arguing. "Then continue it professionally." The words were simple, but something about the way she said them caused several officers to exchange uncertain glances. She sounded less like someone defending herself and more like someone reminding others of responsibilities they already knew. Across the street, whispers spread from neighbor to neighbor. Mrs. Simmons folded her arms tightly. "Something is wrong," she murmured. Naomi would never put this neighborhood in danger. A teenage boy standing beside his father continued streaming the scene on his phone. Thousands of viewers watched from across the country, filling the comment feed with assumptions, accusations, and speculation from people who had never met the woman standing on the porch. Brooks noticed none of it. His focus remained entirely on Naomi. "Who else is inside the house?" he asked. "No one you are looking for," she answered. "That is not the answer I asked for. It is the truthful one." The captain inhaled slowly, fighting visible frustration. Every report he had reviewed before sunrise pointed toward this address. Every briefing insisted time mattered. Yet the woman before him showed no sign of hiding fear, only remarkable patience. Behind him, Officer Liam Foster leaned toward another deputy and whispered, "She acts like she knows something we do not." Brooks heard the comment but ignored it. "Miss Carter," he said, "if you continue refusing to answer direct questions, this situation becomes more difficult for everyone." Naomi looked briefly toward the growing line of emergency vehicles before returning her eyes to him. "Captain, sometimes difficult situations are created by people who believe they already know the ending." Her words lingered in the morning air. Even the reporters setting up cameras paused for a moment, sensing something impossible to explain. Brooks checked his watch. Nearly 6 o'clock. Headquarters had expected progress by now. Instead, the operation remained frozen by a woman wearing house slippers and speaking with quiet certainty. Then Naomi glanced toward the grandfather clock visible through the open doorway behind her. The old clock chimed softly once. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, almost as if confirming an appointment only she understood. When she opened them again, her expression had not changed. "Captain," she said gently, "you still have one opportunity to prevent every person standing here from making a mistake they will remember for the rest of their careers." Brooks stared at her without speaking. Somewhere above them, the helicopter continued circling. Somewhere beyond the barricades, another news truck arrived. And beneath the growing tension, a feeling neither officer nor neighbor could explain quietly settled over the entire street, as though everyone had become part of a story whose true beginning had not yet been revealed. Captain Ethan Brooks had spent 23 years wearing a badge, and experience had taught him that fear revealed itself in countless ways. Some people talked too much. Others refused to make eye contact. A few became angry because anger felt stronger than uncertainty. Naomi Carter displayed none of those signs. She simply waited. That troubled him more than any argument could have. He glanced toward the tactical command vehicle parked beneath a towering oak tree. Detectives stood around folding tables covered with aerial photographs, neighborhood maps, and printed reports. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Every intelligence summary insisted this address mattered. Yet standing only 20 feet away from the woman at the center of the operation, Brooks felt an uncomfortable crack forming beneath his confidence. Officer Liam Foster approached quietly. "Captain," he said, keeping his voice low enough to avoid the nearby microphones. "The thermal scan still shows only one person inside the house." Brooks frowned. "Run it again." "We already did. 3 times." Brooks looked back toward Naomi. "Any movement in the basement?" "Negative." "Garage?" "Empty." "Attic?" "Nothing." The captain folded his arms. None of it matched the briefing they had received before dawn. He disliked mysteries, especially ones that grew larger instead of smaller. Across the street, reporters adjusted camera lenses while producers whispered into headsets. The first national news helicopter appeared beyond the clouds, joining the local aircraft already circling above the neighborhood. Online, millions of viewers continued watching live feeds from dozens of phones held by curious residents. Naomi noticed the cameras, but seemed completely uninterested in them. She slowly stepped off the porch onto the brick walkway, stopping beside a small flower bed filled with white lilies still sparkling with early morning dew. She bent down and gently straightened one flower that had leaned sideways after the previous night's rain. The tiny gesture felt strangely ordinary against the extraordinary scene surrounding her. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons watched with tears beginning to gather in her eyes. She planted those after her father passed away, she whispered to another neighbor. Every spring she takes care of them before she does anything else. Brooks heard the comment. For a brief moment, the carefully constructed image in his mind of a dangerous suspect collided with the woman quietly protecting delicate flowers while surrounded by armed officers. The contradiction irritated him. Facts mattered more than impressions. Or at least they were supposed to. His radio suddenly crackled. Captain Brooks. He immediately reached for it. Go ahead. No updates from federal databases. The requested confirmation still has not come through. Brooks pressed the transmit button harder than necessary. Keep checking. Yes, sir. Silence returned. Naomi looked toward him with an expression that almost resembled sympathy. Waiting can be difficult, she said softly. Brooks narrowed his eyes. What exactly are we waiting for? Not what, she answered. Who? Before he could respond, a black sedan rolled slowly toward the police perimeter but stopped when officers waved it back. An elderly male carrier stepped out wearing a blue postal jacket despite being off duty. I know her, he called. She has lived here for years. There has to be some mistake. Officers politely redirected him away from the scene, but his words lingered among the growing crowd. Brooks felt pressure building from every direction. The media expected answers. Headquarters expected results. His officers expected leadership. Yet the only person who appeared completely untouched by the weight of the moment was the woman everyone had come to confront. Naomi slipped one hand into the pocket of her sweater and removed an old silver pocket watch, its surface worn smooth by decades of careful use. She opened it, listened briefly to the faint ticking inside, then smiled almost imperceptibly before closing the cover. Right on schedule, she whispered, barely loud enough for Brooks to hear. He instinctively looked at his own watch. 6 o'clock exactly. At that precise second, every police radio on the scene emitted the same sharp electronic tone simultaneously, and the street that had been filled with certainty only moments earlier suddenly became completely still. Every officer reached for a radio at the exact same moment. The synchronized alert cut through the quiet neighborhood with mechanical precision, replacing whispered conversations and the distant sound of helicopter blades with a sharp electronic pulse that nobody on the street had heard before. Captain Ethan Brooks immediately lifted the receiver to his shoulder. This is Captain Brooks. Go ahead. Static answered him first. Then an unfamiliar voice, calm and unmistakably official, came across the secure channel. Stand by for priority transmission. Do not proceed until further instruction. Brooks frowned. The wording was unusual. There was no agency identification, no dispatcher number, only authority carried in a voice that expected instant compliance. Around him, other officers stared at their own radios with matching confusion. Officer Liam Foster lowered his hand slowly. Captain, mine received the same message. Another deputy nodded. So did mine. Brooks looked toward the tactical command vehicle where technicians were already checking communication equipment. One of them removed his headset and shook his head, signaling that nothing appeared to be malfunctioning. Everything was working exactly as designed. That realization made the silence even heavier. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the flower bed, watching none of the officers and all of them at the same time. She neither smiled nor celebrated. She simply waited with remarkable patience, as though she had seen moments like this before. The morning breeze carried the scent of damp grass and fresh coffee drifting from neighboring homes. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime gently tapped against a porch ceiling, sounding almost impossibly peaceful against the growing uncertainty. Brooks slipped the radio back onto his shoulder and took several measured steps toward Naomi. "Did you know this was going to happen?" he asked. She met his eyes without hesitation. "I knew someone would eventually ask the right questions." "That was not my question." "No," she replied softly. "It was not." The answer frustrated him more than open defiance would have. She never challenged his authority directly. Instead, every response forced him to reconsider the assumptions supporting it. Behind the police perimeter, the crowd continued growing. Parents arriving home from early school drop-offs parked along nearby streets. Joggers stopped mid-route. Delivery drivers slowed their vans to watch from a distance before continuing on. Every new arrival asked the same question. Nobody had an answer. The live news coverage became more cautious as reporters realized the expected dramatic confrontation had never materialized. Instead, viewers watched a woman quietly standing in her front yard while dozens of officers seemed increasingly uncertain about their own mission. Brooks returned to the command table where detectives compared fresh updates appearing on laptop screens. "Anything?" he asked. One analyst looked up. "The federal database just locked us out." "Locked out?" "Yes, sir. Every authorization code we had 5 minutes ago is now suspended pending higher review." Another detective added, "Our search warrant status now reads temporarily restricted." Brooks stared at the screen. He had never seen those words appear during an active operation. Procedures existed for everything, but this did not resemble any procedure he recognized. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the weight of dozens of waiting officers, hundreds of watching neighbors, and millions of online spectators pressing silently against every decision he made. Then another radio transmission arrived. This time, every officer could hear it through external speakers mounted inside patrol vehicles. "All personnel on scene will maintain current positions. Additional federal representatives are en route. Estimated arrival for minutes." No agency name followed. No explanation came afterward. Only silence. Brooks slowly turned toward Naomi once more. She removed the silver pocket watch from her sweater, opened it again, and listened briefly to its steady ticking. Then she closed the cover with quiet care and looked toward the eastern end of the street where the first rays of sunrise were beginning to break through low gray clouds. "They are early today," she said almost to herself. Less than a second later, faint in the distance, came the unmistakable sound of several powerful engines approaching the neighborhood with deliberate, unhurried confidence. The low rumble grew louder with every passing second until 3 dark government sport utility vehicles turned onto the street in perfect formation, moving neither fast nor slowly, but with the quiet confidence of people who expected the road ahead to clear before they arrived. Every patrol officer instinctively stepped aside. Reporters lifted their cameras higher. Even the helicopter above widened its circle, as though giving the arriving convoy room to breathe. Captain Ethan Brooks watched the vehicles approach, searching for agency markings. There were none. The polished black paint reflected the flashing police lights like mirrors, revealing nothing about the people inside. The lead vehicle rolled to a gentle stop 20 feet from Naomi Carter's front gate. Its engine shut off. For several long seconds, no one opened a door. The entire neighborhood seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Then the rear passenger door opened, and a woman wearing a dark navy business suit stepped onto the pavement. She appeared to be in her early 50s, her silver hair neatly pulled back, her posture straight without seeming rigid. She carried no briefcase, no visible badge around her neck, and no expression of urgency. Instead, she quietly surveyed the scene before her eyes settled on Naomi. Something almost imperceptible softened across her face. She walked forward with measured steps, stopping just inside the police perimeter. Captain Brooks immediately approached. "Ma'am, I am Captain Ethan Brooks with Arlington Police. This is an active investigation." The woman nodded politely before reaching into her jacket and presenting a small leather credential wallet. Brooks examined it carefully. The seal embossed inside immediately caught his attention. His eyes widened for the briefest moment before he looked back at her. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell?" he asked quietly. "Yes, Captain," she answered. "Thank you for maintaining the scene." Brooks lowered the credential without fully understanding what it meant for his operation. "May I ask why your office is involved?" Colonel Mitchell looked toward Naomi before answering. "You may ask." Brooks waited. She offered nothing more. The silence carried its own authority. After another moment, Colonel Mitchell continued walking until she stood only a few feet from Naomi. Instead of extending a handshake, she placed her right hand over her heart and gave a respectful nod. Naomi returned the gesture with equal simplicity. No dramatic greeting, no emotional reunion. Just two people acknowledging one another with the quiet familiarity of professionals who had shared difficult responsibilities long before this morning. The exchange did not go unnoticed. Officer Liam Foster whispered, "She knows her." Another deputy replied, "Not just knows her, she respects her." Across the street, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons wiped away a tear she did not realize had formed. The woman she had known for years as a quiet neighbor was suddenly being greeted with unmistakable dignity by someone whose presence had brought an entire police operation to a standstill. Captain Brooks stepped closer again. "Colonel, I need clarification. My department received credible intelligence connected to this address." Colonel Mitchell accepted the folder he offered but did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked directly at him. "Captain, I do not doubt that you acted according to the information available to you. The question now is whether you are willing to act according to the information that has just become available." Brooks hesitated. Around them, dozens of officers listened without pretending they were not listening. The first rays of sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting warm light across the brick walkway, where Naomi still stood with effortless composure. Colonel Mitchell slowly opened the folder, scanned the first page, then closed it again. "I believe," she said in an even voice, "this operation has reached the point where assumptions must give way to facts." As those words settled over the silent street, another secure radio alert sounded simultaneously across every police vehicle, but this time the display screens showed 6 words that caused every officer within sight to stop breathing for a moment, awaiting direct authorization from the Pentagon. No one spoke after the message appeared. The flashing words on every patrol vehicle screen seemed almost unreal, reflecting across windshields and polished hoods, while the early morning sunlight slowly replaced the blue glow of emergency lights. Captain Ethan Brooks read the message twice before looking toward Colonel Sarah Mitchell. She neither confirmed nor denied what everyone had just seen. Instead, she folded the investigation folder beneath one arm and turned calmly toward Naomi Carter. "Good morning, Naomi," she said with quiet warmth. "I apologize for the delay." Naomi smiled for the first time that morning. It was not a smile of victory or satisfaction. It was the gentle expression of someone relieved that the right people had finally arrived. "You made good time," she answered. Colonel Mitchell glanced briefly at the silver pocket watch still resting in Naomi's hand. "You still carry it." Naomi closed the cover carefully. Every day, the exchange lasted only seconds, yet it carried the unmistakable familiarity of two people connected by years of shared experience rather than recent introductions. Around them, officers watched in complete silence. Officer Liam Foster quietly leaned toward another deputy. "Whatever this is, it started long before today." Captain Brooks stepped forward again, determined to regain some understanding of the rapidly changing situation. "Colonel Mitchell," he said respectfully, "my officers deserve to know whether we are facing a national security matter." She looked directly at him. "Your officers deserve accurate information. They will receive it when I am authorized to provide it." Brooks nodded slowly. He recognized the tone. It was not evasive. It was procedural. There was an important difference. Behind the police line, reporters continued broadcasting live, but even they had become noticeably quieter. The dramatic confrontation they had expected had transformed into something far stranger. No raised voices. No panic. Only disciplined professionals speaking carefully while an entire neighborhood waited for answers. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons remained standing beside her mailbox with folded hands. She remembered Naomi carrying groceries for her after knee surgery, helping neighborhood children build birdhouses during summer weekends, and quietly attending every Memorial Day ceremony, without ever talking about herself. Looking at Colonel Mitchell now, Mrs. Simmons realized there had always been a part of Naomi's life that no one on the street had ever known. Colonel Mitchell reached into her jacket and removed a secure satellite phone. She checked the screen briefly before handing it toward Naomi. "They requested to speak with you directly." Naomi accepted the phone without surprise. She listened for several moments before speaking in a calm, measured voice. "Good morning, sir." Nothing else could be heard. Every officer watched, trying unsuccessfully to read her expression. She nodded once. Yes, sir. They remained professional under difficult circumstances. Captain Brooks lowered his eyes for a moment, surprised by what he had just heard. Naomi had been given an opportunity to criticize the operation. Instead, she had defended the officers standing only a few yards away. After another pause, Naomi answered softly, Understood. I will remain here until you arrive. She ended the call and returned the phone to Colonel Mitchell. Thank you, she said. Mitchell inclined her head. He will be here shortly. Brooks looked between them. May I ask who that was? Colonel Mitchell answered without hesitation this time. You may. Brooks waited. She continued. You will meet him in person. The response was simple, yet it carried enough certainty to silence every further question. A cool breeze swept across the neighborhood, rustling the American flag beside Naomi's front door until it unfurled completely in the growing sunlight. She looked at it quietly before turning back toward Captain Brooks. Captain, she said with genuine kindness, today will be remembered by everyone standing here. The only thing still undecided is whether it will be remembered as a story about assumptions or a story about integrity. Brooks held her gaze for several long seconds. For the first time since arriving before dawn, he realized the operation was no longer about finding someone inside a house. It had become a test of something much harder to measure than evidence. And somewhere beyond the distant sound of approaching aircraft, that test was only beginning. The faint sound Captain Ethan Brooks had noticed only moments earlier steadily grew louder until everyone on the street instinctively looked toward the eastern sky. It was not the sharp rhythm of news helicopters or the familiar hum of traffic crossing the nearby highway. This sound carried a deeper, steadier cadence that seemed to arrive with deliberate purpose. Even before the aircraft became visible beyond the morning clouds, several officers exchanged uncertain glances. Colonel Sarah Mitchell remained perfectly still. Naomi Carter quietly folded her hands in front of her, her attention fixed on the horizon rather than on the dozens of people watching her. The neighborhood itself seemed transformed. The flashing emergency lights that had dominated the street since before sunrise suddenly felt less important beneath the warm golden light spreading across rooftops and front lawns. Birds cautiously returned to the maple trees lining the sidewalks, their songs drifting through moments of silence that no one wanted to interrupt. Captain Brooks removed his cap for a moment, rubbing his forehead as though trying to organize facts that no longer fit together. Every report he had trusted before dawn now seemed incomplete. Every assumption had become another unanswered question. Officer Liam Foster stepped beside him. Captain, he said quietly, I checked public records while we were waiting. Brooks looked at him. Did you find anything? Liam nodded slowly. Almost nothing. What does that mean? There are records showing Naomi Carter paid her property taxes every year, volunteered with local charities, and served on 2 community education boards. Then there is a gap. A gap. Nearly 12 years where almost every employment record is classified or unavailable. Brooks frowned. That is unusual. Liam gave a nervous smile. That is the most unusual background check I have ever seen. Nearby, reporters continued speaking into cameras, but their confident narratives had begun to disappear. Instead of describing an arrest, they now admitted they were witnessing an unfolding federal matter whose details remained unknown. Social media commentators who had rushed to conclusions only an hour earlier were now asking entirely different questions. Who was Naomi Carter? Why had federal authorities intervened? Why would someone with such obvious composure remain standing outside instead of retreating indoors? Mrs. Eleanor Simmons slowly crossed the street after receiving a silent nod from one of the officers guarding the perimeter. She stopped several feet from Naomi, careful not to interfere with anyone's work. Naomi, she said softly, are you all right? Naomi turned toward her elderly neighbor with the same warm kindness she had shown for years. I am Mrs. Simmons. Thank you for asking. Mrs. Simmons hesitated before speaking again. Is there anything you need? Naomi smiled gently. Just keep believing that people are more than the rumors told about them. The older woman nodded, emotion filling her eyes. Without another word, she quietly returned to her side of the street. Colonel Mitchell watched the exchange with quiet appreciation. You never stop taking care of people, she said. Naomi answered without looking away from the neighborhood around her. Some promises do not end when the assignment does. Mitchell's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Captain Brooks heard the sentence clearly. Assignment. The word echoed inside his thoughts. It was not the language of ordinary civilian life. Before he could ask another question, every head turned toward the end of the street. 2 additional black government vehicles entered the neighborhood, moving with the same calm precision as the earlier convoy. This time, however, small American flags were mounted discreetly on the front fenders. They stopped behind Colonel Mitchell's vehicles, and suited personnel stepped out with quiet professionalism, scanning nothing, rushing nowhere. One of them approached Colonel Mitchell, leaned close, and spoke only 6 words. Her posture straightened immediately. She looked toward Naomi, then toward Captain Brooks. "Captain," she said respectfully, "our final authorization has arrived. In the next few minutes, you are finally going to understand why this house was never the real story." Captain Ethan Brooks felt the atmosphere change before anyone spoke another word. It was subtle, almost impossible to describe, yet every experienced officer on the street sensed it. The urgency that had driven the operation since before dawn quietly gave way to disciplined restraint. Radios fell silent. Detectives stopped flipping through folders. Even the reporters lowered their voices, recognizing that whatever happened next would not resemble the story they had expected to tell. Colonel Sarah Mitchell accepted a slim black portfolio from one of the newly arrived officials. She opened it carefully, reviewed only the first page, then closed it without allowing anyone else to see the contents. Turning toward Brooks, she spoke with the calm precision of someone who measured every sentence before saying it aloud. "Captain, before we proceed, I need confirmation that every officer under your command will follow updated federal instructions without exception." Brooks answered immediately. "They will." Mitchell studied him for a brief moment, then nodded. "Good. That answer matters." Naomi Carter quietly stepped back onto her front porch. She did not retreat into the house. Instead, she rested one hand on the weathered wooden railing, watching the morning unfold with remarkable composure. Sunlight now reached the small brass wind chime hanging near the entrance, causing it to shimmer softly as a light breeze passed through. The gentle sound floated across a street that only an hour earlier had been filled with tension. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons noticed it as well. She remembered hearing that same wind chime every spring afternoon when Naomi watered her flowers. Somehow its familiar melody reminded her that the woman standing before dozens of officers had always been the same neighbor she had known for years. Officer Liam Foster quietly approached Captain Brooks again. "Sir," he whispered, "our system just updated." Brooks extended his hand. Liam passed him a secure tablet displaying a single line of text where the earlier investigative file had once appeared. Brooks read it twice before looking back toward Colonel Mitchell. "The case designation has been removed." Mitchell gave a small nod. "It has been replaced." "With what?" "Need to know." Brooks exhaled slowly. Under normal circumstances, the answer would have frustrated him. Instead, he found himself accepting that this situation had long since moved beyond ordinary procedure. His attention shifted toward Naomi once more. She had never attempted to leave. She had never raised her voice. She had never treated anyone with disrespect despite the extraordinary pressure surrounding her home. That realization weighed heavily on him. Across the neighborhood, online commentators who had spent the morning guessing at her guilt were beginning to change their tone as reporters acknowledged the growing federal presence. Rumors slowly gave way to questions. Questions slowly gave way to silence. Colonel Mitchell finally turned toward Naomi. "Everything is ready." Naomi inclined her head. "Then let us finish this the right way." Mitchell smiled faintly. "Just as you always insisted." Brooks noticed the exchange immediately. "You have worked together before," he said. Naomi answered honestly. "A long time ago." "Doing what?" She looked toward the American flag beside her front door as it lifted gently in the morning breeze. "Serving my country in the way I promised I would." Brooks waited for more. None came. Yet for the first time, he no longer felt the need to force an answer. He was beginning to understand that some stories revealed themselves only when every piece had reached its proper place. At that exact moment, another dark sedan entered the neighborhood without lights or sirens. Unlike every vehicle before it, the officers nearest the barricade immediately stepped aside without receiving a command. Colonel Mitchell straightened her posture. The suited officials quietly formed a respectful line. Naomi slipped the silver pocket watch back into her sweater pocket and drew one steady breath. The driver exited first, opened the rear passenger door, and everyone on the street instinctively became silent, knowing that whoever was about to step onto the pavement carried the answer that had changed the course of the entire morning. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. The man who stepped from the rear passenger seat looked nothing like the image most people imagined when they heard the word power. He wore a simple dark suit without medals, without visible insignia, and without the dramatic presence of someone seeking attention. Yet the moment his polished shoes touched the pavement, Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood at full attention. The other federal officials followed instantly. Captain Ethan Brooks noticed that no commands had been given. Respect had arrived before protocol. The man quietly surveyed the neighborhood, taking in the flashing patrol vehicles, the gathered reporters, the anxious faces behind windows, and finally Naomi Carter standing peacefully on her front porch. A warm smile crossed his face. "Good morning, Naomi," he said. "I hope they did not keep you waiting too long." Naomi smiled back with the quiet familiarity of an old colleague. "Not at all, General Reynolds. They were doing the job they believed they had to do." Brooks heard the name and felt his thoughts stop for a fraction of a second. General David Reynolds was one of the most respected senior leaders in the Department of Defense. Seeing him standing on an ordinary residential street, without public announcement or security spectacle, was almost impossible to process. Brooks immediately introduced himself. "General Reynolds, Captain Ethan Brooks, Arlington Police Department." The general extended his hand without hesitation. "Captain, thank you for keeping everyone safe this morning." Brooks accepted the handshake, surprised by the sincerity in the general's voice. "Sir, I am afraid I no longer understand what this operation has become." Reynolds nodded. "That is understandable. You were given information that was accurate but incomplete." He turned toward Naomi again. "May I?" She answered with a simple nod. The general addressed everyone within earshot, speaking clearly enough that both officers and reporters could hear. "Naomi Carter has never been the subject of a federal investigation." A ripple of astonishment spread through the crowd. Cameras immediately shifted toward Naomi, but she remained perfectly composed. Reynolds continued. "For more than a decade, Miss Carter served this country as a civilian intelligence specialist supporting highly sensitive defense operations. Her work required extraordinary discretion. Much of her service remains classified today, and it will likely remain that way for many years." Brooks looked toward Naomi with genuine disbelief. Nothing about the quiet woman who planted flowers, walked her dog, and helped neighborhood children with homework had ever hinted at such a life. The general continued speaking. "When people dedicate themselves to protecting others without seeking recognition, they often become invisible by design. That invisibility is not a weakness. It is part of the responsibility they accept." Mrs. Eleanor Simmons quietly covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Memories flooded back through her mind. Every holiday Naomi had quietly spent at home. Every time she politely declined questions about her previous career. Every occasion when she disappeared for several days and returned with nothing more than a gentle smile and a simple explanation that she had been traveling for work. None of it had seemed unusual until now. Captain Brooks cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, if Miss Carter is not the subject of this investigation, why was this address identified?" General Reynolds exchanged a brief glance with Colonel Mitchell before answering. "Because someone under federal protection was connected to information that briefly intersected with this location. That matter had already been resolved before sunrise. Unfortunately, not every database updated at the same speed." Brooks slowly lowered his eyes. The realization settled heavily across his shoulders. 30 police vehicles, dozens of officers, hours of public attention, all built upon information that had already changed before anyone arrived. Reynolds looked toward Naomi once more. "You knew we would correct it." Naomi answered quietly. "I trusted the system. I also trusted the people inside it to choose integrity once they had the truth." Her words lingered over the silent street, and Captain Brooks realized they were not only meant for him. They were meant for everyone who had watched the morning unfold before deciding who Naomi Carter must have been. Captain Ethan Brooks had faced difficult mornings before, but none had ever left him feeling quite like this one. The weight on his shoulders no longer came from responsibility alone. It came from realization. He slowly looked around the neighborhood that had awakened expecting danger and now stood surrounded by something entirely different. Officers who had arrived with absolute confidence were quietly lowering their notebooks. Reporters who had rushed to capture a dramatic arrest now found themselves recording an unexpected lesson in humility. Neighbors who had watched from behind curtains stepped a little farther onto their porches, their expressions shifting from fear to quiet reflection. General David Reynolds accepted the investigation folder from Captain Brooks and carefully closed it without reading another page. "Captain," he said, "your department followed the information available to you. That is not the problem." Brooks listened carefully. "The problem," Reynolds continued, "is what happens after new information arrives. That is when character becomes visible." The words settled heavily over the street. Brooks nodded once, understanding exactly what the general meant. Earlier that morning, he had believed every answer was already in his file. Now he realized the most important truth had never been written there at all. Colonel Sarah Mitchell quietly stepped beside Naomi Carter. "Your neighbors deserve to know at least one thing," she said softly. Naomi looked across the familiar faces lining the sidewalks. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons. The Martinez family standing beside their mailbox. Young Tyler still holding his bicycle helmet beneath one arm. People who had waved to her every morning for years without ever asking why she sometimes disappeared for weeks or why she always declined recognition whenever the community thanked her for volunteering. Naomi smiled gently. "They already know the part that matters." Mitchell tilted her head slightly. "Which part is that?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Whether someone is worthy is revealed by how they treat others when nobody is watching." Mrs. Simmons quietly wiped another tear from her cheek. Suddenly, dozens of ordinary memories returned with new meaning. Naomi carrying groceries through snowstorms for elderly neighbors. Quietly paying for a struggling family's Thanksgiving dinner without leaving her name. Spending Saturday afternoons teaching local children mathematics at the library because she believed confidence often began with simple encouragement. None of those moments had required classified files or impressive titles. They had simply revealed the kind of person she chose to be every single day. Captain Brooks slowly walked toward Naomi until only a few feet separated them. Every camera immediately turned in his direction. He removed his cap, holding it respectfully at his side. "Miss Carter," he said sincerely, "before this morning I believed I understood the situation. I now understand that I understood very little." Naomi listened quietly. Brooks continued, "If my decisions caused you unnecessary hardship or embarrassment, I sincerely apologize." The neighborhood became completely silent. No reporter interrupted. No officer moved. Naomi looked directly into his eyes, seeing not the confident commander who had arrived before dawn, but a man willing to acknowledge a mistake in front of everyone he led. She answered with the same calm voice she had carried throughout the entire morning. "Captain, apologizing does not make you weaker." Brooks remained silent, pretending nothing happened would have. A faint smile appeared on Colonel Mitchell's face. General Reynolds gave the slightest approving nod. Officer Liam Foster quietly lowered his gaze, recognizing that he had just witnessed something rarely seen in public life. Brooks slowly replaced his cap. "Thank you," he said. Naomi shook her head gently. "Do not thank me." She glanced toward the officers still standing respectfully across the street. "Take care of the people who trust you. That will always matter more than being right." The morning sun climbed higher above the quiet neighborhood, warming the brick walkway, the white lilies beside the porch, and the American flag moving gently in the breeze. For the first time since the operation had begun, the flashing emergency lights no longer seemed to define the scene. Instead, they simply reflected against a peaceful home where dignity had remained unshaken long before anyone realized who Naomi Carter truly was. The first patrol car eased away from the curb without lights or sirens. Then another followed. One by one, the long line of police vehicles that had transformed the quiet neighborhood before sunrise began disappearing from the street with the same discipline that had brought them there. No one applauded. No one celebrated. The only sounds were tires rolling across damp pavement, birds returning to nearby trees, and the soft chime hanging beside Naomi Carter's front porch, catching the gentle breeze. Captain Ethan Brooks remained where he stood, watching his officers leave in orderly formation. He knew they would remember this morning for the rest of their careers. Not because of what they had almost done, but because of what they had learned before it was too late. General David Reynolds quietly observed the departing vehicles before turning toward Naomi. "You could have demanded an investigation into the operation," he said. "You could have insisted on disciplinary reviews. Nobody here would have questioned that decision." Naomi looked down at the white lilies beside the porch, gently brushing a single raindrop from one of the petals with her fingertips. "Would that help anyone become better?" she asked. Reynolds smiled faintly. "That sounds exactly like the answer I expected." Colonel Sarah Mitchell folded her arms comfortably. "You always measure success differently from everyone else." Naomi stood silently for a moment before answering. "Success is not proving someone wrong. It is making sure they leave with the chance to become right." Those words settled quietly across the nearly empty street. Officer Liam Foster happened to overhear them while loading equipment into a patrol vehicle. He stopped for a moment, reflecting on everything he had witnessed since dawn. When he first arrived, he had assumed the woman standing inside the modest brick home was hiding something dangerous. Now he realized the only thing hidden had been a lifetime of humble service that never asked for recognition. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons slowly crossed the street again, this time carrying a small wicker basket covered with a neatly folded kitchen towel. "Naomi," she said with a gentle smile, "I made blueberry muffins before all of this started. They are probably cold now, but I thought you might still like them." Naomi laughed softly, the sound warm enough to ease the last traces of tension lingering in the neighborhood. "Mrs. Simmons, your muffins are never just muffins." The older woman smiled through misty eyes. "Your father used to say that." Naomi accepted the basket with both hands. "He also used to say kindness tastes better when it is shared." Without another word, she lifted the towel and offered the first muffin to Captain Brooks. He looked genuinely surprised. "After everything that happened?" Naomi nodded. "Especially after everything that happened." Brooks hesitated only briefly before accepting it. "Thank you. You have had a long morning," she replied. Around them, several officers quietly smiled. The simple gesture carried more weight than any formal speech could have. It reminded everyone watching that dignity was strongest when it refused to become bitterness. General Reynolds glanced toward Colonel Mitchell. "You once told me she would always choose grace over recognition." Mitchell answered softly. "She has been proving that for years." A young reporter lowered her microphone and quietly turned off her camera. She had planned to broadcast a dramatic ending to a breaking news story. Instead, she found herself witnessing something much rarer. A story where forgiveness spoke louder than accusation. Captain Brooks looked once more at Naomi before preparing to leave. "Miss Carter," he said, "I hope our paths cross again under better circumstances." Naomi smiled. "Captain, every new day gives us better circumstances. The only question is what we choose to do with them." Brooks nodded thoughtfully before walking toward his vehicle. As the last police cruiser disappeared around the corner, the neighborhood slowly returned to ordinary life. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk again. A mail truck stopped at the next house. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through open kitchen windows. Yet everyone who had stood on that street understood something had quietly changed forever. They had arrived believing authority was measured by uniforms, vehicles, and commands. They left knowing that the strongest kind of authority often stood quietly on a front porch, answered every challenge with dignity, and never forgot that character could accomplish what power alone never could. By mid-morning, the neighborhood looked almost exactly as it had the day before. The barricades were gone. The helicopters had disappeared beyond the horizon. Fresh sunlight shimmered across trimmed lawns, and children waiting for the school bus laughed as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the events of that morning, ordinary life no longer felt quite the same. Naomi Carter stood in her front yard watering the white lilies with the same quiet care she had shown for years. Drops of water sparkled in the sunlight before disappearing into the dark soil beneath the flowers. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons watched from her porch with a warm smile. It amazed her how quickly Naomi had returned to simple routines. There was no interview waiting on the driveway, no celebration, no attempt to explain herself to curious strangers. She simply resumed living the same life she had always chosen. A black sedan rolled slowly to the curb without attracting attention. General David Reynolds stepped out alone this time, carrying only a small wooden box beneath one arm. He walked through the open gate and paused beside the flower bed. "I thought you might appreciate having this back," he said. Naomi looked at the box for a long moment before carefully lifting the lid. Inside rested a modest brass nameplate, slightly worn around the edges, engraved with only 4 words. Civilian Intelligence Specialist. No medals accompanied it. No ribbons. No photographs. Just a quiet reminder of years spent serving without applause. Naomi gently traced one finger across the engraved letters before closing the lid again. "I never expected to see this again," she admitted. Reynolds smiled. "Neither did I." They stood together in comfortable silence while a breeze stirred the nearby trees. Finally, the general spoke again. "Headquarters completed its review this morning." Naomi looked toward him. "And every participating agency received updated procedures. Your case will become part of future training." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Because of me?" Reynolds shook his head gently. "Because of what happened after the misunderstanding. Procedures can teach people how to respond. Character teaches them why." Naomi looked across the quiet neighborhood where children now chased one another down the sidewalk, their laughter floating through the warm air. "Then perhaps something good came from all of this." Reynolds nodded. "Much more than you realize." He reached into his jacket and handed her a sealed envelope. "There is one more thing." Naomi opened it carefully. Inside was a brief letter signed jointly by several federal leaders. It did not praise classified accomplishments or list confidential operations. Instead, it contained a single sentence. "Thank you for reminding us that integrity remains our nation's greatest security." Naomi read the line twice before quietly folding the letter and placing it inside the wooden box beside the brass nameplate. She looked toward General Reynolds with grateful eyes. "That means more than any award. I thought it might." Before leaving, Reynolds glanced once more at the modest brick house, the white lilies, and the peaceful street where so much had changed without leaving a single visible scar. "Naomi," he said, "people will probably never know everything you have done." She smiled gently. "They do not need to." "Does that ever bother you?" Reynolds asked. Naomi shook her head. "If someone sleeps peacefully because another person quietly kept a promise, that is enough." The general stood silently for a moment before extending his hand. Naomi accepted it with quiet respect. As he drove away, Mrs. Simmons crossed the street carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. She handed one to Naomi without saying a word. The 2 women stood together beneath the bright Virginia sky, watching the neighborhood return completely to normal. Passing drivers saw nothing unusual. Children noticed only flowers blooming beside a front porch. Yet those who had been there from the beginning understood that the greatest stories rarely ended with applause. Sometimes they ended with a shared cup of coffee, a quiet promise kept, and a woman who never needed the world to know her name in order to make it a little better. Autumn arrived quietly in Arlington, and with it came mornings filled with crisp air, amber leaves, and the familiar sound of Naomi Carter's wind chime greeting each new day. Weeks had passed since the street had filled with flashing lights. Yet the neighborhood carried a different kind of calm now. It was not the calm that comes from forgetting. It was the calm that comes from understanding. Captain Ethan Brooks returned one Saturday morning without a patrol car, without a uniform, and without an audience. He parked along the curb, carrying only a small maple tree wrapped in burlap. Naomi was trimming the white lilies when she noticed him walking toward the porch. She smiled before he said a single word. "Good morning, Captain." He smiled back. "Today it is just Ethan." She nodded. "Then welcome, Ethan." He looked down at the young maple tree in his hands. "My grandmother always said that when someone teaches you something that changes your life, you should plant a tree instead of buying a gift. Trees remind you to keep growing." Naomi's eyes rested on the small tree for a moment before she quietly picked up a garden shovel leaning beside the porch. Together, they walked toward an empty corner of the yard where the morning sun lingered longest. Neither of them hurried. The earth was still soft from rain the night before, and every scoop of soil carried the clean scent of autumn. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons watched from her porch, smiling as 2 people who had first met under extraordinary circumstances now stood side by side in complete silence, working towards something simple and lasting. After the tree was planted, Ethan brushed the dirt from his hands and stepped back. I almost let one morning define someone I had never truly met, he admitted. Naomi gently pressed the final layer of soil around the roots. The important part is that you did not let that morning define who you became afterward. He looked at the young maple swaying gently in the breeze. I have changed several training sessions already. We spend more time talking about listening now. Naomi smiled warmly. Then this tree has already started growing. A familiar black sedan slowly passed the neighborhood, but did not stop. General David Reynolds sat in the back seat, looking out the window just long enough to see the newly planted maple standing beside the white lilies. He smiled quietly before the car continued down the road without disturbing the peaceful afternoon. He knew no report would ever fully capture what had happened there. Some lessons belonged in policy manuals. Others belonged in the human heart. As the seasons changed, the maple tree slowly stretched toward the sky. Children played beneath its growing branches. Neighbors gathered nearby during summer cookouts. New families moved onto the street, never knowing why the tree had been planted or why Mrs. Simmons always smiled whenever she looked at it. Only a handful of people remembered the morning when assumptions had surrounded a quiet home, only to leave carrying something far more valuable than certainty. One cool evening, a little boy riding his bicycle stopped beside Naomi while she watered the flowers. He pointed toward the maple tree. Miss Naomi, who planted that. She looked up at its golden leaves dancing against the fading sunset. Someone who learned that respect grows much stronger than fear, she answered softly. The little boy considered her words for a moment before nodding thoughtfully and pedaling away. Naomi watched him disappear down the sidewalk, then looked toward the peaceful street that had long since returned to ordinary life. The white lilies swayed gently beside the porch. The wind chime sang its familiar melody. The maple tree stood quietly between them, growing a little taller with each passing season. Naomi smiled to herself, knowing that real strength had never come from hidden titles, classified service, or powerful phone calls. It came from choosing dignity when others expected anger, kindness when bitterness seemed easier, and truth when silence would have been more comfortable. She turned off the garden hose, took one last look at the tree, and whispered the words her father had taught her many years before. Character is what remains after every misunderstanding has finally passed. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We'll see you in the next story.